Funding for this program is provided in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota. This program brought to you in part by Selco.
Hello, and welcome to Reading for Life. My name is Julie Kleinfelter, Library Director in Austin, Minnesota, and I have three very special guests with me today. Our Reading for Life presenter is Michael Verde. Michael graduated with honors from the University of Texas's Plan 2 Honors Program, earned a master's degree in literary studies from the University of Iowa, and an MA in theology from the University of Durham, England. He's taught for 15 years at the university and college prep school levels, most recently at Indiana University, and is currently completing his PhD with a focus on literature and religion. Michael founded Reading for Life in 2005. We're also joined today by Steve Harson, Public Library Consultant for Southeastern Libraries Cooperating, Pam O'Hara, Director of Outreach and Instruction, and Claire Hines, Legacy Coordinator. So welcome everyone. Michael, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Great, Julie. Thanks for the introduction. Why don't we just get right into it with meaning? If we don't think about meaning, we know exactly what it means. But if we start to lean into it and say, what do we mean about meaning? How, for instance, is meaning made? Then we find ourselves in a very interesting intellectual space. So I want to raise the question, how is meaning made? Where does it come from? What is it? Because that's one of the things I think that this novel puts on the table very early by stressing that the truth is a matter of the imagination. So that's why I'm inspired to go down this direction. So towards at least an initial conversation starter, I want to propose that meaning comes from two kinds of relationships. Number one, opposites. In other words, meaning is generated out of binaries. We know what short is because we know what tall is. We know what male is because we know what female is. In fact, everything that we think we understand what it is, we partly do because we have some conception of its opposite. So that's one place, and a vital place where meaning is generated. The second place is the overcoming or the unification of opposites. Where there had been, in other words, two, there is now one in some interesting kind of way. So I want to propose those are two kinds of ways the imagination moves in a quest to make meaning. And with those really on the table, why don't we start with the opposites? Obviously, this book is almost, a tsunami of opposites. But just for fun and for the sake of those listening with us, let's throw some of those opposites on the table. And then after we get some of those, we could explore the unification of opposites. So somebody get us started anywhere, doesn't matter.
Male and female.
Well, and that's a kind of a primordial one. If we were going to think about where do all the opposites come together in some kind of, like, say, image, I think that would undoubtedly be one of the candidates and probably the most alluring candidate. So that's great. Somebody else.
Well, to take that one a little further, I think it goes to gendered and non-gendered.
Excellent. Now that's kind of interesting because now we're talking about opposites with regards to categories. In other words, even now we're not talking about necessarily subjects or objects or things. We're talking about how categories can be opposite of each other, and that's also very deeply interwoven into this novel with regards to how people define things in the way that they construct their entire universes. If you think of, for instance, the religion of the Karhides or the religions of the Argonians, they are really working with abstractions to kind of create an entire mythology. So great example. Somebody else.
Lightness and darkness.
Female and male, light and darkness. I think both of those, I would think, all of a sudden, we're getting down to the getting down right here. So how do those two let's say, sets of binaries relate to each other, because it seems to me that the male, female, light and darkness are themselves in a very interesting kind of conversation. My sense is that female is associated with darkness. One of the sayings of the Handara, which I cannot pronounce, is praise the darkness and creation unfinished. Just to suggest, and you remember the place in the novel where I think it's Estraven, but it may have been Fax the Weaver, suggesting that the ignorance is the ground of all knowledge. This darkness, if we're going to flip, let's say, Western binaries on their head, if we were going to take the binaries that make the Western world, think of the Enlightenment. What is the Enlightenment? It's a movement, really, to displace the mythology of religion by saying that the intellect now is a better source of achieving relationship with the true. In other words, the Enlightenment would take objection to the author's claim that truth is a matter of the imagination. The Enlightenment would say, in fact, no. And among those binaries, even in the very name Enlightenment, was a conquering of the darkness. We're going to take reason. At one point, these philosophers associated with the French Revolution take a bust of reason. So reason in the shape of a woman. They go into the Cathedral of Notre Dame and go to the altar, and they put the bust of Lady of Reason on the altar. Symbolically, this is the Enlightenment. That where there was a God that we achieved through myth and ritual and faith and superstition, perhaps from the philosopher's perspective, now reason is God. This is you can think of this as the moment of the new world. So I'm going to throw this back out here and propose that partly interpolated into the Western imagination is the idea that light is superior to dark and male is superior to female. And just for fun, I think we could explore how this novel is reversing that right into the very notion that darkness is the ground from whence all light comes. And to try to defeat or otherwise extinguish that darkness doesn't lead one to some kind of perfect truth associated with total clarity and light, but rather something closer to hell.
So does that fit into a little bit? We talked a little bit in the first podcast about how the book, because of the pronouns that Le Guin uses, feels very male-centric, just because she constantly uses his, even though Jen Li is the only character who is truly a he, him, I guess. So I'm struggling a little bit with like the darkness and the female in this book because I didn't feel like there was a lot of female. So does that fit in a little bit with what you're saying about how that because that piece is missing, what you see in those cultures on this planet is more of the working for the intellect, but not really getting to the imagination piece?
Yeah, this is great. So let's just put this in, let's interpolate that question into the novel and say that Jen Li is, in some sense, an ambassador from this world in which we're associating the Enlightenment. So let's just say Jen Li is bringing to winter all of those structures of thought that we inhale almost unconsciously as we're acculturated into our life worlds. Okay, so Jen Li is an embodiment of all of these assumptions. So I think that's partly to speak to your question, that Jen Li's initial way of even understanding winter was already being deformed by not the binaries themselves, but the privileging of one. This is, I think, crucial. It's not the elimination of the binary, but the privileging of one that subordinates a binary. So I would think that is one way that we could imagine. First of all, it's just probably the kind of conundrum that every writer is facing right now with regards to pronouns. Okay. Do you do a s/he? Do you do she sometime, he sometime? Okay, so that's partly her challenge, and partly perhaps because who knows what kind of patriarchal assumptions, even with someone as conscientious about those as Ursula Gwynn. Okay, that's a possibility. Another possibility is that Jinli I really is that perspective, and we're seeing that perspective play itself out and what it looks like. So, in other words, we can learn about what the shortcomings are of that assumption by following Jinli I's way of making sense of his experience.
I think part of this is that Ursula Le Guin just didn't have the language at the time. I think if she were rewriting this book now, she would use they, them, or z's or something plural. I mean, I don't want to, she's so brilliant and I don't want to make assumptions. And I know that, non-binary pronouns have been around for a really long time, but they haven't come into regular use until recently. And I think it would be a really fascinating exercise to download the book as an EPUB or a PDF and just do an easy, find and replace and swap out all those pronouns and reread it and see how you interpret it differently when you're actually reading with the pronouns, with non-binary pronouns that align more closely with the culture. Now, of course, Jinli I would still need he, him, but I just think that might be a really interesting little thought exercise, because I agree with Julie. It is so, Jinli I using he, him isn't what tripped me up so much. It's when the other characters refer to themselves with, he, him pronouns. And it's really hard for me to flip my thinking out of that gender binary. And I think if the pronouns were switched, this book would read very differently for me. And I would pick up more on, the subtleties.
Well, and how fascinating, kind of to what Michael was saying too, Claire, how fascinating to see Genly's progression throughout the book, if he had also experienced that, if as he was dealing with these beings on Winter, if they had used different pronouns. Or
and I think that's something that we have all had to work through, or I hope most of us have, as we have had people in our lives change their pronouns, and it takes some work to retrain your brain, and it takes some effort. But then, if you try to switch back, which you obviously should not do, then it feels very unnatural, which is how he feels at the end when he's encountered with this, the people coming from the envoy.
Let me complicate things for myself for just a second, because among opposites are the opposites of the one and the many, the individual and the universal. In other words, there's an opposite even between a kind of collective like they and them and an I. If we're imagining opposites now, and if we're imagining I want to make this first of all, I think that's a fascinating idea, Claire, and it would be really cool to see what that would do to the book. So I'm not speaking to that. I think that's really super cool. But I do want to speak to the fact that there is yet another binary here. They in themselves is a generalization of a plurality. And the opposite of that is I.
For us.
You could think of that, but we're thinking of an individual versus a collective. That too is at the heart of this novel, because the Orgorians have perfected the art of thinking so generally that the individual disappears. This is the contrast between Orgada and Karhide. At Karhide, it's a feudal society where it's a domain of families, because every family is so singular that it is really impossible for the king to achieve a kind of ideal communality. In other words, there's constant division because of the singularity of the domains. And if you take that right down to the individual level, there's an emphasis on the I. In other words, it's competing with the they. The opposite of that would be Argorian where they have in fact effectively extinguished the I by achieving a generality. So I would hesitate to say that we're out imagining Ursula Le Guin, or rather, we're out imagining the imagination that Ursula Le Guin was working with. I would be very hesitant of myself personally to do that, because this too is a binary that doesn't refute in anything what you're saying. It just it actually makes it more interesting, I think, for me. How do we have a they that doesn't extinguish? Because if you take the uniqueness, if the how does my I not get lost in the group? Let's say I identify with a group of people that are an alternative group. I'm among the, let's say, the transgender. How do I keep my singularity among this transgender? I wouldn't want to disappear among the transgendered any more than I'd want to disappear among the sexist. So I'm suggesting that there is a binary here that complicates things, but in a great way, because one of the things that Estraven or generally I, because at some point the voices are their mind speaking each other, is that the love comes out of the differences, and that that love is the bridge between the differences. In other words, I'm going to propose that the imagination that imagined this novel was not trying to get rid of dualities. In fact, to get rid of a duality, which you can see experiments with that, is actually a kind of dictatorship or totalitarianism that would not lead to diversity. It would extinguish diversity. So I think it's an insistent upon this intractable paradox of our meeting each other in a space that will never totally be unified, and yet precisely because of our intractable uniqueness, something can occur between us that binds us without eclipsing our uniqueness. And I want to just say that the one and the many, or the I and the they, is itself a binary, and we could lose something by getting rid of that duality. And I'm only insisting upon it because this seems to be at the heart of how this novel ends. That doesn't take away from the fact that undoubtedly anyone who writes is going to, even when their imagination has done multiple drafts, okay, we're all going to project our ideological assumptions. Right now, we're doing it, okay, and people 20 years from us will say, if those people would have learned, okay, it's impossible, but you got to start from somewhere. So undoubtedly, there are things ideologically that we could critique about the novel, but I would be hesitant to move too quickly there, because we might be being read by the novel as opposed to reading the novel. One of the things that absolutely, almost quit my first PhD program, is because I sat in a classroom with young people, myself included, who took turns educating the author on political correctness. Okay, this author didn't understand this, and this author didn't understand this, and I got to listen to. I'm paying for this. I got to listen to a cohort of 20-year-olds educate some of the most imaginative minds in the history of the Western world. So after a while, I thought, I'm not getting a whole lot out of this. And I want to say, with regards to this novel, certainly there are things that we could critique ideologically. But it might be that this novel is working at a depth of discernment. It wouldn't be the great novel that it is if the five of us sat here and could figure out off the top of our heads all the ways to write it better. It simply wouldn't. So I just want to throw that out there, that there is a binary between they and one. And our issue with pronouns, which is a wonderful issue, I would think, because it's getting us to some very important conversation. So I think it's wonderful that there is this movement to challenge pronouns, because what we're doing really is forcing ourselves to talk about identity at a deep, deep level.
Well, and I think that's interesting, because as you've talked about like hierarchy, and we talk about male and female, I think that's one thing that does come out in the book, is that idea that you don't, like, the binaries are important as opposites, but they're not necessarily good or bad. the hierarchy is problematic, but the opposites aren't necessarily good or bad. It's just how they relate. And exactly that idea that love comes from the differences, and that is that bridge between the two is the important part, maybe not so much that there is good and bad with the light and dark. Even, there is that whole idea that you have to have the light to see the dark and the dark to see the light, and those kinds of things too. So I think that's kind of an interesting piece of that, and that I think that comes out in the story as well, is that Estraven and Genli, as their relationship progresses, they see each other, they see the differences are obvious, but there are similarities too, and that is exactly what you said. That's where that bridge, that the love comes out of those differences, and the progress that Genli takes with just the people of the whole world, where he sees himself less as the alien and more as part of who they are because of the time he spent there.
I think that's really, think of how the intellect can't stand opposites. Okay. I'm just going to throw this: the intellect cannot stand opposites. What does Genli say at one point to Estraven? Maybe you've just taken paradox and made it a way of life. He's talking about the Handara. The intellect cannot stand paradox. In other words, the intellect can't stand metaphor. So even this desire to bridge is just going back to the Enlightenment. That is a very, let's say, aggressive move of the intellect over other facets of our consciousness. Do you see what I'm saying? The intellect can be above, let's say, intuition. The intellect can't stand dualities, and it's going to resolve dualities. And the epitome of that is Meshe. Meshe is a god in which all unique, we are his pupils. We have all disappeared into Meshe. And what does Meshe do? Extinguish all darkness. Meshe is a symbol of what we would think of as Satan. All differences have been expunged, but look how she's critiquing the Western world sense of enlightenment, because it's total light that is the hell of Meshe. So I'm suggesting the intellect will always, the intellect's fine with the binaries, but when you start talking about unifying the binaries through paradox and metaphor, then the intellect and the imagination all of a sudden become a binary.
The things that we're discussing as the devices that the author does to construct their story. And I think about the book hanging against the backdrop of the historical context of what was happening in our society during these times. Basically, women's liberation movement, the feminine mystique, the National Organization of Women, the Equal Rights Amendment, Mary Tyler Moore being the first woman to be a single working woman on television, that women couldn't apply for a credit card on their own. If they wanted to buy a car, they had to have their husband there with them. And that we were in a very binary society, and we were under this great movement. It's a civil rights movement, the Equal Rights or the Women's Liberation Movement, to find a way for women to go beyond that. And does this book hold a special place in that particular movement in regard to, here was somebody's imagining what a space in our society that didn't have those dichotomies or those hierarchies or those power inequalities set up in them? Is this book exploring what that would look like? And like some of the opposites that you're talking about, Michael, I think they would fall into that. And also the good and evil, the light and dark. I think that could be very much a part of the devices that she's using to explore the concept of what would greater equality look like.
Just makes me think how, imagine as you describe the context, and as Claire mentioned, in our own sort of ideological development, it makes me think, because this book was published, I believe, in 1969. Mm-hmm. It makes it seem all the more what a remarkable gift of consciousness. Almost as if the ecumen was coming. In other words, that we can imagine this entire novel as something with which we are going to relate to in a more or less generative way, which is to say, as Ginley I and Estraven, and I'm just saying Estraven, one, because I'm from East Texas, and two, because the Raven, I think, is absolutely crucial here as a messenger from the divine to the mundane. As those two were learning this mind speak, imagine that as a symbol of what may or may not be happening between the reader and this novel.
And I would also say, Michael, I'd be really curious to take somebody, and I would say a woman, from my mother's generation or my grandmother's who lived through that women's liberation, burning your bra period, and how they would read this book compared to how I would read it. And for that reason, I was really interested in Claire's concept. Like, what if we just went through and changed the pronouns? If we did that, would that speak to like our current generation a little more clearly? But for our mothers and grandmothers, maybe the way it's written spoke to them more clearly. A different, what is it? A different dialectic or a different kind of a conversation that we have now than we could have had then.
Even if we have ideological sort of objections, we're in intense dialogue with the novel. So the fact that we would see things differently is just the development of consciousness for which literature exists. In other words, there's no book that's ever going to be written that 20 years later, people are going to say, yep, you're completely on cue with where we are ideologically now. So but it doesn't mean that the book isn't contributing. Our very objections to certain things is the kind of duality and dialectic. And then the question is not that we have a dialectic, that's wonderful, is how is it going to be generative versus how is it going to become sterile? The dialectic, the duality, I think this book is affirming, is not something we want to extinguish. Rather, how is the conversation going to go? When two binaries come together like this, what's going to happen next? Is it going to be this? Is it going to be this? Or is it going to be something like this without any one of these hands disappearing? The left and the right hand. I really think it's like this. This is the distinction that is made between a body politic and a body mystic. That the ecumen is not a body politic. It's a body mystic. This is a big image to get our mind around. Why the distinction between a body mystic and a body politic? And to engage with that is to engage with going all the way back to Fax the Weaver being at the center of this web of differences. What a beautiful image to have the source of the foretelling come from the contributions of the most marginalized, including those that are deemed insane. In other words, that the foretellers weren't made up of a bunch of PhD people who had the foretellers were assembled out of the people who were the least of these, with a certain kind of consciousness in the center that was weaving the differences.
Michael, can you talk just a little bit for a second? Can you backtrack just a little bit and talk about what you mean by body politic and body mystic?
Yeah, first of all, let me just say, let's try to imagine what the novel is talking about and not me. So That's important. I'm just going to propose that it has something to do with how these differences are ultimately brought into a community. They could be brought into a community in the feudalistic way that we have masters and slaves. That's one way to resolve difference. And I think we would agree. And isn't this what I can't pronounce the word, Shiftgether?
Shiftgrithor. Mm-hmm.
It's just, this is Shiftgrithor is talking like this. Mm-hmm. My speech is talking like this. So in some way, this novel is about, okay, we're going to have differences. How are we going to communicate? So I would say going back to that, the body politic is a hierarchy. And that hierarchy can either be resolved by a king at the top or a pharaoh, as they do in Karhad, or look at the Kana even worse, because Genli I says that they're less primitive in Argata and more sinister. So they don't have a hierarchy in our Ogorian. They've got something worse. They've got Meshi that extinguishes all difference. That's also a way to respond to duality. And it's also a failure into death. So I would imagine that the body mystic is, how do we maintain our absolute uniqueness and have community? How do we have maximum diversity and maximum unity and never let those go, and hang on to both of those? Think of in two different religious spheres. Eastern religions, they have an image of this in an Indra's net. It's a net of jewels where every jewel you see reflected all the other jewels. So every jewel is the whole jewel. And also, if you look at it a different way, one jewel in a net of jewels. And the analog to that in the Abrahamic religions is the body of Christ, where we're simultaneously a member of the body, but also the entire body. In other words, we're never just an elbow. We might be an elbow, but turned inside out, we're the whole body. That's a body mystic coming from the Abrahamic religions. And I suspect, in a very influential source of inspiration for this book, within Taoism, you see this in the yin and the yang. There is a reconciliation of opposites that extinguishes neither and maintains the differences.
Got it.
But going back to this truth as a matter of the imagination, I want to just throw out there that this does not mean that Ursula Le Guin, I'm going to say her imagination, because I have learned that the empirical author is not the person that writes these novels. There is something that they are channeling. Okay, they are really envoys. They are really channeling this is the whole idea of an ambassador. They're channeling something. Okay, in any case, whatever imagination wrote this, the perception that it's not neutral ultimately, that darkness is the ground of light, and that ignorance is the ground of knowledge. What are the Handara trying to learn? All of the questions that are meaningless, so that you quit asking the questions instead of answering them. Remember the line that to oppose something is to repeat it? Do you remember, even if you oppose something, you're keeping it alive? So how do you break out of, how do we break out of left and right? How do we break out? Well, one thing is probably the economy doesn't want us to break out of it, because it's generating this heat is generating all kinds of great stuff, right? People are making a killing. Okay, you walk away from it because you're somewhere else now in consciousness. That's no longer your issue anymore. Doesn't mean that you've extinguished one of the sides. It means both of them have been taken up into a higher dimension of consciousness. That's the dialectic that moves us to another place where, now, this is why the Buddha didn't answer certain questions, because the question itself was the symptom. And in Abrahamic religions, this is why when Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth, Jesus didn't answer. I'm getting to why does the author say that the truth is a matter of the imagination? That's really what I'm getting at. Why is it that we have to answer what is true with a story, and not, as the Enlightenment folks would say, by getting down to breaking down these molecules into quarks? Do you see what I mean? The entire Western project was going to get to the bottom of what is, and we were going to conquer death in that way. And somehow that starts to disintegrate. That's not really an option either. I would propose that the imagination is the integration of intellect and feeling, which is just, and I'm just going to this direction. I'm throwing out for consideration that Estraven is a symbol of the imagination. which is why generally I can't get his mind around it. Generally I cannot get his mind around Estraven. He thinks Estraven's being ironic when Estraven's being honest. You see, he cannot understand Estraven because Estraven is a higher mode of consciousness, which is why Estraven would be a traitor to every society, right? If you're not integrated to the social structures, you're an exile. If the social structures are deformed and disfiguring, and you're not playing the same game, well, you could say that Rosa Parks was a traitor. She was a traitor to the norms. I would imagine that everyone who dares to introduce a degree of consciousness for which they're not receptors in their social world is going to be deemed a traitor. You're messing up the game. Going back to fiction, I think this novel is itself, I think Estraven, I'm just saying for fun, is in some sense the embodiment of this novel. That if this novel was going to be in this novel, it would be Estraven, if you see what I mean. If we were going to pretend what's our relationship to this novel, we could imagine Genly I and Estraven and say, where am I in this relationship? And it would probably be mirroring where we are with this novel. That's what I want to propose. That this novel is ourself a journey through winter. We are with this novel trying to make it through winter on this incredibly physically extracting trial in which life or death is at stake. And our companion here on the sled is this novel. I'm proposing that for fun and suggesting that might open up all kind of neat conversations that are taking place in the novel. Because ultimately, this novel involves the reader, or it wouldn't be a great work of fiction. And I'm suggesting that it involves us by entering into a kind of kimmer with us that is not sexual, that includes all of those feelings, but achieves something that's even more intimate. Another way of saying this is that you could imagine that this novel is all about learning how to read.
I thought for sure you were going to fit the word consummate in there somewhere, Michael.
Well, okay, if that's great, as long as in the consummation, one of the two doesn't disappear.
Right. Right.
That's the weird thing, right? How does two become one without one of the ones disappearing? And in the intellect, I'm suggesting, can't stand it. The intellect is offended by the lack of reconciliation, which is, I'm guessing, why it gets not going to experience love. The enlightenment is, Meshi is the pinnacle of the enlightenment. I'm just going to throw this out there. If you want to see a critique of Western world at its deepest level, Meshi is the apex of fundamental Christianity. Meshi is the God that is a devil. And it is the ultimate achievement of the Enlightenment. I can't imagine a greater, more trenchant critique of patriarchy, because this is going right at the God of patriarchy. The God of patriarchy is Meshi, and Meshi is a devil. Total lightness that extinguishes every shadow, and it's a devil. That knows, that sees everything. I'm suggesting that's not an image. I'm suggesting this novel is not suggesting that's an image of a God, that the all-seeing God is an image of Satan. Which, I mean, think about that. In terms of the traitor that her imagination was to her time and place. Okay, to write this, you are betraying every sacred assumption. That takes a lot of guts. So I'm saying Estraven, in other words, is symbolizing what consciousness would be if it outgrew its ideological context. And look at the difference between the way Estraven ends and Meshi ends. Estraven dies to achieve the integration of Gethin with the Ecumen. Estraven's death enables it. So Estraven ends by dying. Meshi ends by everything else being extinguished. Those are two very different images of divinity. This took a lot of guts to write this. And fortunately, we don't understand it, or it would be even more offensive, if you see what I mean. I mean, if can you imagine this book come out and people understood the real depth of critique, that this is your God and your God is a Satan, and that's what's underwriting all of your fundamental assumptions, including about gender? They would have burned that woman. That's why it's important that for the pyramid, that people don't learn to read. In other words, there are certain power structures that the most dangerous source of opposition is the imagination that manifests through art. To extinguish that is the primordial necessity of maintaining the body politic. Which is exciting because we're doing something traitorous. The imagination is not yielding to the deep assumptions that keep this social structure intact. It's risking a movement to another degree of consciousness for which there is no social body. But how about this? Let's make it just get real, because that's abstraction. Let's get real particular. The first time Genly I is around Estraven, what does he say? It's on page 7, that he felt in Estraven the warmth of the sun. He had the authority. Let me read it. I don't like him. He's speaking about Estraven. Yet I feel and respond to his authority. And we know, and I think I hear Claire's great point right now. Why is it his authority? Because this is a man-woman. It could be her authority here. Okay, so I think that's I feel that too right now. Okay, I don't like him, yet I feel and respond to his authority as surely as I do to the warmth of the sun. Now that right there, I'm going to suggest is a golden thread that leads us right to the question: why is this world called winter? And what is happening between the weather and temperature and the climax of this novel when these Genly I and Estraven are trying to cross this threshold and survive together with the possibility of freezing to death? A way of saying this is that there's a source of light that is not coming from nature, that's coming between two people. There is an authority of the spirit that is a heat. Do you see what I'm saying? That Estraven's authority was bringing a warmth, and that warmth was not the same thing as the intellect. You can think of the intellect as light without heat. That's not the imagination. You see what I mean? Total light and no heat, you die.
I'm trying to remember where I saw something that Le Guin was asked about the he. And she said that she just, started writing and going along, and that at some point where she needed to use gender, she realized that she had referred to this a character as a he, and so she just continued that as a matter of simplicity. But she said it could have just as easily been she. And I can't remember whether was it in the prologue, or was it something else that I read completely?
Thank great question. It's resonate with me. Maybe it's in the kind of introduction there too.
It might have been, but
I
anyway,
think it
I
is.
think about that, and how that word could have just as easily been she. And so, to Claire's exercise, maybe it would be a more instructive exercise to go replace all the he's with she's and
Great.
see how it read.
I love that
Because
thought.
even the author herself said that that would be just as plausible.
That'd be
I think
really
it would be.
interesting. I think there's endless ways that you could construct that. You could take pronouns out entirely. You know, that is very possible with the human language. You could use zim or zer or something like that. That, you know, again, I think at the time she was writing, that language, if it did exist, was so in its infancy. And if she had published a book, you know, doing that, like Michael said, she would have been burned at the stake. Can you even imagine? People wouldn't have been able to conceptualize it. They can, you know, I think even today that is a huge struggle. Our language is shifting. The fact that I don't think of they them as often plural as I do singular now, because I have so many friends who use they them pronouns, and so that they them to me can embody both a plural and a singular. I think is a big shift in language, that in the context of when this was written wouldn't have worked or made any sense or been accepted at all. And I think bringing in she her might bring in like a power struggle, right? Because you have a male character, you know, who is now constantly together with a character who is going to be perceived as female by the reader because of our own biases related to pronouns, you know. And how would that dynamic change if we started seeing them as male and female instead of male and male, or male and, if you're really able to, you know, be abstract in your thinking as you read, you know, male and non-binary.
This is why imagination is the truth is a matter of the imagination. The intellect simply will continue to participate in Shiftgreth or whatever it's called. The intellect is stuck now. You see, I would say there's no vocabulary amount of modulation that will get us out of this if the consciousness that is fighting over the vocabulary is at the same level of maturity. It will never end. It'll just keep, unless our consciousness grows out of that. This is what I think the book is getting at. That there is that is why winter and darkness is so vital, because light in the sun, okay, is not going to get out of this. What is the saying of the Handra? Praise the darkness and creation unfinished. Now, is that the opposite of any kind of understanding of Christianity? Have you ever heard of? I have never. The darkness is associated with Satan in my imaginative history, and creation has already been made perfectly and finished, and we can just believe in it or not. This is the mythology I grew up with. So for Esterven's motto to praise then darkness and creation unfinished, I think I'm saying is speaking to where we are right now, because I don't believe there's a resolution with light and with the intellect's insistence on a kind of resolution that eliminates the paradox. The paradox is not, if you extinguish a paradox, you're going to kill the darkness and then you're in hell. Now, I'm just for the sake, we only got so much time, I'm saying things that you should probably support with all kind of textual references, but I'm saying that you get rid of the darkness, you get meshy, and that's hell. And I'm saying that's the imagination, and I'm saying that novel associates that with female.
Where is that quote in the book, Michael?
Well, let's see. One place is 264. He says it. Esterven says it twice.
Okay.
Praise the creation unfinished is on 245. A way to think about it is, what's the difference between the religion of the Handara and the religion of the, what do they call them, Yamesh Shada, or whatever, the followers of Meshi? That here's another way of thinking of that collision. This looks to me like a symbolic way of putting Eastern religions, principally Taoism, being a source for the Handara, versus the Abrahamic religions being a source for the religion of Orgorian. In other words, I think the Ursula Gwynn is putting another polarity here of Eastern and Western modes of consciousness. And if you were going to say what is the closest thing that I'm aware of in any kind of mythological tradition that maps onto this novel, it would be Taoism. And they have a word in Taoism called none such, or wu wei. That's exactly what Nusith means, no matter.
No matter.
It means no matter, which means you've outgrown the collision. It's no matter. You're not there anymore. I grew up in a interpretation of the Old and New Testament that was so profoundly sexist that you couldn't even speak truth if you weren't a man. And you would have absolutely any paradox that man did not resolve and tell you what the meaning was, and then add this because the Bible tells us. That's how every question was resolved. A man would say, the Bible tells us, and then that man would say exactly what he learned from the ideological space that he grew up in, and then he would say it was God speaking. That's what I grew up in. And I'm suggesting that this novel speaks a very different language. And we can't make sense of this novel without being willing to not think like that man. And then I also want to throw out here, I can't imagine a more profound understanding of the symbolism of the Old and New Testament than what Ursula Gwynn is channeling. In other words, I'm making a distinction between an ideological appropriation of the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. In other words, turning that into a dogma, versus understanding how to read that same book of books with the imagination, and then channeling the profundity through that book of books into a new work of art. So I'm making a distinction between the profundity of the spiritual vision in the Hebrew and Christian Bibles and the way ideologies take it and turn it into something that is the perversion of what it is, if you can speak its language. So I want to stress that this, I don't imagine Ursula Gwynn is saying that the Old and New Testament are meshy. I'm suggesting she's saying, if you read those books of books, if you read that book of books in this way, it will be diabolical. If you read it in this way, it'll be generative.
So it all comes back to that truth and how you come up with that truth, whether you think your imagination or your intellect.
Partly that would be a way to think about it. How do you live with this book? What do you have to do with this book? Can it be a source of heat? I'm imagining now Ginley and Estroven in that little kind of womb. Is this going to be a source of heat for you that gets you through that trek? Is it going to be the authority of the warmth of the sun, or is it going to be the light of Meshi? That's a way to imagine what's going on here. And if it didn't involve us that deeply, it wouldn't be a great work of literature.
All right, we just have a couple minutes left. Any last thoughts?
Let me close by saying that last time we talked, I embarrassed myself beautifully by saying that I had read so deeply that I noticed that the Gethians could not say the word I, when it turned out it was the letter L. But I knew it was important that they couldn't say this letter, whatever it was. I got it absolutely wrong, which makes a joke of my close reading. So That's one thing. So I've been living with this. Why is it genre? And why even generally odd to begin with? And there is some wonderful, what does Estervan say when they're crossing? That the first time he heard Generally I's name, it sounded like a cry of pain. Like I. Now, the second thing is if you get rid of the L, generally turns into genre. So I did some etymological check here. Guess what? It's the etymological root of the word gender.
Oh.
So a cry of pain because of this gender fixation on one side of a duality. That the very name of this character is the cry of pain of being isolated, speaking of winter, from that other half of you that you've suppressed.
And on that note, thank you so much for joining us today, and make sure you check out our podcast. We have another podcast about the Left Hand of Darkness that'll be coming out soon. So you can find all that on the Austin Public Library website. Thanks, guys, and we'll see you soon.
Funding for this program is provided in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.